The last few days, we have been going over the ratio and trying to see what does our spirituality, what does the ratio say about humanities, and kind of trying to go deeper into those numbers. So today, we're going to sort of continue, but a little bit of a different tact. We're going to look at what is our plan here this year, okay? The other day, one of you asked me, sort of the rector, what do I do as rector? Especially given that, your assistant is really the point person for your formation. One of the things that I'm responsible for is really trying to give the direction and the vision, right? Obviously working with my team, but it's to remind us of that vision and really try to set the vision. So that's what I want to talk about today, okay? So, foundational story. What is a foundational story? Well, when I never did humanities in my Legionary formation, due to the fact that I'd studied before. So since I've arrived here, I've felt the desire and the need to brush up on my humanities. So doing that, I started with some of the biggest classics, the oldest classics, the Iliad and the Aeneid, okay? So what is a foundational story? Well, the Iliad, many of you probably know, was written by Homer about in the years 700, 800 BC, okay? And he was writing about a time before himself, so probably 1000, 1200 BC, okay? And when he wrote this story of the Iliad, it's a battle, in there he's talking about what people did, their culture, right? And so when we read the Iliad, we see, okay, this is what people were doing at the time of Homer or the time before Homer, okay? And then throughout the history of Greece, the Iliad was a point of reference. So since the time it was written until today, really, people continued to read it and think about it and reflect on it, right? And it really became a story that formed and informed Greek culture, right? To the point where, as I was reading the Iliad, I was also reading some commentaries, and one of the commentaries I read was very interesting because it gave the example of, at the end of the book, here's a spoiler, Achilles kills Hector. Okay, Achilles is the big warrior he's the hero for the Greek, and Hector's the hero for the Trojans. And so Achilles kills Hector, and he ties him to the back of his chariot, and he drags his body around. Okay? Because at the time of the story, when you beat an enemy, if you really wanted to say, look, I beat you and I'm the complete victor, I wouldn't let you bury the person's body, or cut off your head, or I defigure the body to say, look, I beat you so bad that you're not even going to have a good burial. Because for them, being buried was important because that, led you into the afterlife. So as he's doing this in the Iliad, Zeus and the other gods are looking down, and they're seeing this, and Zeus says, that's not good. What Achilles is doing is not good, right? And so they protect his body and things like that. But that was being read by the Greeks for centuries and centuries and centuries, to the point where you get to, I think it's the 2nd century, where Sophocles writes the play Antigone. And the whole framework of the Antigone is the king kills this guy, and the guy's sister wants to bury his body, and the king won't let her. And so the whole play is about that, her kind of fighting to be able to reclaim her brother's body to be able to bury him, right? So you can see that reading this and reflecting on this, Zeus, the king of the gods, had said that this was not good to not, to defigure or destroy a body, right? And so we come down the centuries to the point where now they're seeing the value and the respect to respect the dead body even, right? So we see how that affected their culture and formed their culture. So it's been the foundational story for the Greeks and the Greek culture. Then when we come to the Aeneid, so the Romans come into power, and especially Caesar Augustus lived about the time of Christ, right? The Romans took a lot from the Greeks. They beat the Greeks in the war, but then they really admire the Greeks. And a lot of their culture came from the Greeks. So they get to the point where Caesar Augustus is kind of like the epitome, in a certain sense, of the Roman culture, and he decides we need a foundational story too. So he gets Virgil, poet, to write the story. And Aeneid, he's a character, he's a Trojan from the Iliad who escapes the war, and then he comes to found Rome, according to the Aeneid, right? And so from the very first time it was written, the Aeneid became like a foundational story for Greek. There were already snippets in their culture, things they believed, and Virgil took on these things and kind of expanded on them to make this whole story. But from the time it was written, right away it became a classic. In the schools, the people, they would be reading the Aeneid, and this helped form and inform who they were as Romans and what they were called to be and what their values were, right? So as I was reading these, the question came to me, well, what's our foundational story as legionaries? Especially in the light of the fact that we know, our founder had some, the scandals involved in his life, and it was very shocking revelation to a lot of us when we found out about that. We hadn't expected that. Because I remember when I was in the novitiate and going through my formation, whenever we wanted to explain a virtue or talk about some aspect of legionary life, very, very frequently we would refer back to the founder, right? Charity. How does a legionary do charity? I remember one of the stories we used to tell each other, and this would go from generation to generation, was, at one point the founder was at a gas station and someone pulled up on the other side of the gas station, and it happened to be one of the guys who was trying to destroy the Legion and criticizing the founder. And so the founder went in and paid for his gas. And say so even the people who persecuted us were called to, to show charity towards them, right? And there were stories like this that were passed on, from novices to brothers to brothers to priests to brothers, etc. So when the scandals with the founder came, and it becomes obvious that, okay, he's not the person we thought, he's not the model that we have to follow, the question is, okay, now what do we do? Have we just lost? Because in a certain sense, that was a big crisis for a lot of legionaries, because we learned so much of who we were through him. How is a legionary called to do apostolate? How is a legionary called to pray? And we'd always be looking, or very often be looking at the founder. So as I reflecting on this, came to mind one of the, in one of the first, or the early volumes of the founder's letters, he had a letter that he wrote probably in the 40s. And the details I remember, I'm not 100% sure, but what I remember is he was in Spain and he was staying in the Paulist convent or monastery, right? And in the letter he writes, I spent all afternoon and evening pacing back and forth the terrace, thinking about the foundation that we're doing and wondering who is the saint, or who do we take as our model to help us imitate and follow. And time again, I come back with the answer that our only model has to be Jesus Christ, right? Because like when you think about the Franciscans, in a certain sense, they're definitely trying to imitate Christ, but following the example of Saint Francis. The Dominicans, they're trying to imitate Christ, following the example of Saint Dominic. And that, in a certain sense, that's what we were trying to do, follow Christ, following the example of our founder. But when all of that fell apart, it's like, okay, now what do we do? But remembering this letter of who we're called to follow and imitate directly, and even the founder back in the 40s when he was doing this said, we're called to imitate and follow only Jesus Christ, right? So, having read that, sorry, this is I meant to say, so the question is, okay, what's our story, right? What's our foundational story? Looking to the constitutions and considering number 4 of our constitutions, right? Legionaries make present the mystery of Christ, gathering the apostles around him, revealing to them the love of his heart, forming them and sending them out to collaborate with him in building up his kingdom, right? So this number of our constitutions says that we're called to follow and imitate Christ. We're called to make present the mystery of Christ. Right? Now, when we read this, we can still say, well, in a certain sense, this is a lens through which we can read the gospel. And Christ is continuously doing this. He's continuously gathering, forming, revealing his love, forming and sending them out. So us specifically as humanists, what came to my mind was Caesarea Philippi. This is when Jesus, he's already called his apostles. He's gathered them around. He's been with them for a while. They've been seeing him do miracles. They've been listening to his preaching. They're talking to as he's preaching and curing, they're talking to the people. They're listening to the people. They're hearing what the people are saying about Christ. And they come to Caesarea Philippi, and Jesus looks at them, gathers them around the campfire, and he says, who do people say that I am? This is the critical moment. And this is humanities, right? You've been with Christ. You've been talking to him, listening to him, seeing him do the things he does. And now he comes and he says, who do people say that I am? So that's the focus I'd like to give to this year. Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And under this banner, there's kind of three aspects. The first, who am I? Who am I? That's getting to know myself, okay? My identity. So we're going to be working on self-knowledge, self-awareness. Who am I? Next, who is he, right? Who's Christ? Getting to know Christ better, going deeper into his identity, right? And that's, once again, keeping Christ at the center. Finally, the third aspect is, who are we? Who are we as legionaries? Right? Growing as legionaries. So that's a little bit, a snapshot of the vision that I have, that I've talked about with the other formators, we've shared about. I was sharing today with the professors, and I'm now sharing with you. And the hope is that at different times throughout this year, we'll be able to gather and discuss this and to see, okay, what does this say for me as a first-year humanist, a second-year humanist, as formative humanists, so that we can come together and hopefully really make present this mystery of Jesus Christ, gathering, revealing, forming, and sending.